Treason is not the reason for the season. Episode 13, Thomas Jefferson, lone defender of Shays' Rebellion. After blowing up the federal building, McVeigh was captured wearing a t-shirt the front which had an image of President Lincoln with a caption from his assassin, John Wilkes Booth, Sic Semper Tyrannis. Thus always to tyrants. On the back was a quote from Thomas Jefferson, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." The tree of liberty quote is a favorite by Militia-as-Terrorism extremists. Another of their favorite Jefferson quotes is, "A little rebellion now and then is a good thing." The Militia-as-Terrorism extremists scream that these quotes prove that the Founding Fathers designed the Constitution and Second Amendment to create militias as private, anonymous, paramilitary groups, outside government control, with stockpiles of unregistered weapons, training to overthrow the government. But their argument works only if one is completely and entirely ignorant of American history. Remember when Shays' Rebellion occurred and the nation recoiled in horror? In January of 1787, Shays marched 1,500 men on the Federal Armory in Springfield, Massachusetts in an attempt to seize its weapons and wage a full-fledged armed insurrection. The Articles of Confederation had created a federal government so weak that it could not afford an army to oppose Shays. Shays' Rebellion ran amok with up to 4,000 men, for 10 months, before the governor of Massachusetts raised a militia big enough to end the rebellion. Many at the time saw Shays' Rebellion, and the possibility of future rebellions, as an existential threat to the newly found nation that had just won its independence from England. Shays and the threat of future rebellions like it, caused the nation as a whole to throw out the weak Articles of Confederation and design a stronger federal government under the Constitution. One strong enough to be able to put down rebellions like Shays. One that explicitly declared armed rebellions like Shays to be treason. The Constitution was ratified by the entire nation roundly condemning men like Shays. What did the Founding Fathers say after Shays' Rebellion? John Adams called Shays' Rebellion an act of terrorism. Benjamin Franklin called Shays' Rebellion a dangerous insurrection. Alexander Hamilton said Shays' Rebellion had Massachusetts plunged into a civil war. John Jay said the inability of the federal government under the Articles of Confederation to raise troops to fight Shays made the inefficiency of the federal government more and more manifest. James Madison, liberty may be endangered by the abuses of liberty. Madison is also considered the father of the Constitution, which declares armed rebellion like Shays the highest crime in the nation. George Washington called Shays' Rebellion a cloud of evils. One lone founder defended Shays, Thomas Jefferson. Here's the timeline overview. Shays' Rebellion occurred from August of 1786 to June of 1787, with the attack on the Federal Armory happening in January of 1787. The Constitutional Convention was from May of 1787 to September of 1787. In January of 1787, Jefferson wrote a letter to James Madison defending Shays. And in November of 1787, Jefferson wrote a letter to William Stevens Smith attacking the draft version of the Constitution and again defended Shays. In June of 1788, the U.S. Constitution is ratified by the nation. In his letter to Madison, Jefferson wrote, "So far as I have yet seen, they do not appear to threaten serious consequences." Then he wrote one of his oft-quoted lines, "I hold it that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing." In his letter to Smith, Jefferson had received a draft of the proposed Constitution and railed against it. There are very good articles in it, and very bad. For one, Jefferson said he did not like the idea of the office of President as spelled out in the Constitution. History, Jefferson said, had set me against a chief magistrate. Jefferson preferred the much weaker design of federal government under the Articles of Confederation. There was no singular office of President under the Articles of Confederation, only the much weaker Continental Congress. Jefferson accused everyone of overblowing Shays' Rebellion, the reason the Constitutional Convention was happening in the first place, in order to seize power for themselves. Wonderful is the effect of impudent and persevering lying, about the colonies being in anarchy. Yet where does this anarchy exist? Where did it ever exist, except in the single instance of Massachusetts. And can history produce an instance of a rebellion so honorably conducted? Jefferson argued that Shays and his men storming the federal armory in Springfield to seize federal weapons was honorable instead of traitorous. Jefferson then argued that men like Shays would be pacified if we but explain the facts to them, let them take arms. The remedy is to set them right as to facts, pardon, and pacify them. Jefferson was certain that men who had committed violence based on ignorance would not shout fake news, when presented with facts that disagreed with their beliefs that lizard alien overlords rule Earth and eat human babies. He then invokes some terrible math: we have had 13 states independent 11 years. There has been one rebellion. That comes to one rebellion in a century and a half for each state. Jefferson's logic is this: if you have one rebellion in the first 11 years of a new nation, then you can multiply by 13 states in that nation, and say you had one rebellion in 130 years. But why stop at states? The 13 colonies had over 600 counties in them. So why not take the 11 years and multiply by 600 counties and say you had one rebellion in 7 centuries? Because it's ridiculous math. That's why. Jefferson is using the Chewbacca defense here. Jefferson then showed callous indifference toward any innocent people killed by rebellion and domestic terrorism. What signify a few lives lost in a century or two? Jefferson's numbers here are completely out of date. There were over 60 domestic terrorist attacks and a dozen mass shootings every year that Trump was in office. During the period from the 9/11 attacks until Trump left office, right-wing domestic terror attacks accounted for 335 deaths. 2021 has seen the number of mass shootings skyrocket. The Gun Violence Archive counted 267 mass shootings in the U.S. in the first half of 2021 alone. And that doesn't count the people killed by the iron pipeline. Militia-as-Terrorism extremists push for unregulated guns so they can have their own little private terrorist organization with stockpiles of unregistered weapons. And it is specifically this lack of regulation that makes guns easily available to criminals with cars and cash. The U.S. has one of the highest gun homicide rates in the world, 4.4 per 100,000. Roughly 14,000 gun homicides per year. Jefferson asked what signify a few lives lost in a century or two. But the militia-as-terrorism extremists' demand for unregulated guns to play out their paramilitary fantasies creates an easy source of guns for criminals, and in the last century or two has resulted in millions of Americans being killed. Jefferson then states his oft-quoted line, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." Jefferson concludes with his hope that someone would stop the Constitution from being ratified. I hope in God this article will be rectified before the new Constitution is accepted. 8 months later, in June of 1788, the U.S. Constitution is ratified. These two letters, both sent by Jefferson in 1787, are the source of militia-as-terrorism extremists' two favorite quotes. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. A little rebellion now and then is a good thing. Militia-as-terrorism extremists scream these quotes prove the Founding Fathers designed the Constitution and Second Amendment to create militias as private, anonymous, paramilitary groups training to overthrow the government. But militia-as-terrorism extremists always leave out a few important facts. These two quotes are made by Thomas Jefferson in defense of Shays' Rebellion. Of the 7 men considered to be the Founding Fathers of the United States, 6 condemned Shays' Rebellion. Only Jefferson described Shays' Rebellion as honorably conducted. These letters do not reflect the intentions of the founders for their design of the Constitution or Bill of Rights because Jefferson had nothing to do with writing the Constitution and Bill of Rights. Jefferson was in France during this period. James Madison is considered the primary author of the Constitution and Bill of Rights, and the Constitution defines armed rebellion like Shays to be treason and places militias subservient to the government, and the Second Amendment ties the right to bear arms directly to these militias, subservient to the government. The Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791, and 1 year later, the Militia Act of 1792 was passed, making universal registration for militia service the law of the land. Militia-as-Terrorism. Extremists use Jefferson's quotes to argue that the Founding Fathers as a whole intended for militias to be like Shays' Rebellion, private, anonymous, paramilitary groups, with unregulated and unregistered weapons, able to overthrow the government whenever they didn't like who got elected dog catcher. But Jefferson alone defended Shays' Rebellion while the other Founding Fathers and the nation as a whole condemned Shays. And Jefferson's letters aren't showing the intent of the Constitution's design, instead they are railing against the Constitution, and attempting to downplay the rebellion that caused the convention in the first place. While Jefferson tried to argue that a little rebellion and a little murder was a good thing, the nation as a whole said rebellion was treason and ratified that sentiment into the Constitution. Furthermore, history shows that Jefferson's quotes point to principles not reflected in Jefferson's actions. In 1787, Jefferson's Tree of Liberty quote argued that patriots should spill their blood to fight tyrants. But just a few years earlier in 1781, Jefferson was governor of Virginia and commander of the state militia. When the British invaded his state, Jefferson was expected to call up the militia and lead them into battle. Instead, Jefferson packed his bags and ran from the fight. Jefferson was called the Coward of Carter's Mountain as a result. In 1787, Jefferson said the Tree of Liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots, but in 1781, Jefferson ran away from military service to defend his own country. Jefferson's second quote defending Shays' Rebellion said a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. But Jefferson's own actions in two different historical events contradict Jefferson's words. The first event is Jefferson's attempt to suppress the Haitian Revolution. The second event is Jefferson's attempt to convict Aaron Burr of treason. Both could be considered rebellions and Jefferson did everything in his power to stop them. These events are covered in more detail in the next video. Treason is not the reason for the Second Amendment. Treason is not the reason for the season.